So the topic for today is a nice, easy one. Suffering. I know, right? Fun. So we are going to try and just together unpack that. And a lot of that kind of concept of suffering calls us to have a lot of questions. So we know the first few questions is, well, why do people suffer at all? Why, if God is a loving God, do people still get hurt? Why do good people die? If there is a God if God is good, why does Love Island exist, for example? All different kinds of suffering there. And it's important for us to kind of start to unpack that a little bit about ourselves, I guess, first. And so if we were to take the alphabet, 26 letters, and we try to think of an emotion representing each letter, A, B, C, there are actually loads we could think of. Probably not for some of the more challenging letters. We'd probably stretch it a bit and say, today I'm feeling a bit xylophony. That's okay. But the point is that there's a lot that we feel. There are highs, there are lows, and some days we feel one emotion, and either the next day or even within the next 10 minutes or an hour of feeling that emotion, we switch and we can feel the complete opposite of that emotion. If we take David, so wrote the Psalms, was a king, slayed Goliath. If we look at Psalm 10, we hear that it's written, "Why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" So he's not okay. He's saying, it feels like you're nowhere near me. It feels like this is really hard. And then we hear Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Some days he's asking the same questions we are, which is, why is this happening? Why does it feel like I can't feel or know a presence of a God? And then other days it doesn't feel like that. It feels like we go, actually, this feels great. This is brilliant. And some months, some years, it feels like the balance of those things is very different. And for some people in the same situations, the balance feels very different. One person going through something might feel a lot happy about it, and another person might not. And we have to be aware of that. We have to accept that not only is it okay for us, but it happened in the Bible. It happened with these people that we look to and say, well, they're heroes of the faith. I'm nothing like them. Yes, you are. We are. And that's a great thing in that we don't need to try and force ourselves to be something we're not. I'm leading this session as one of the youth workers. I don't have the answers to them all. And that's okay. The other youth workers who are with us, who do other sessions with you guys, we don't have all the answers. We daily probably have questions very similar to you. Why? Where are you? How's this going to pan out? How is this going to end? How's it going to finish? And I guess a huge thing that would be great for you to take away from this process of understanding suffering today is that's completely okay. We've seen that that's the stuff that to have those questions, to ask why, is something that we see David do. But also, I'm reading a great book called God on Mute. It's written by Pete Greig, but right at the beginning about this book, which is about unanswered prayer, he points out that even Jesus had unanswered prayer. So we worry and we struggle with when we ask God a specific thing, he doesn't maybe answer it our way, or something we really want for someone to get better, and it doesn't happen. And we struggle with that a lot, and that's also okay. But actually he talks about the fact that Jesus went to the garden and said, if there's another way, if there's a different thing to this thing that I have to do, please let me have it. But if not, I'll do it. And even on the cross, when he says, why have you forgotten me? We see him having prayers that seemingly are unanswered. Now, of course, we see the story open up and we know there's a different ending to that. But it's helpful, I think, to know that sometimes questions will be there and they may not have an answer. That doesn't mean we just give up or we choose to be negative about it. So very quickly, I'm just going to go through some, I guess, silly big questions, but just to frame in a more light-hearted way the idea of there are questions that in this world we have no idea about. So do stairs go up or down? Right? That's one question for you. I'll leave you to answer that yourself. Do people yawn in their sleep? Is the word dictionary in the dictionary? Do penguins have knees? Do fish ever get thirsty? Really important questions. And so, again, we have these things. Those are very silly questions, but these things that actually we might have an answer to, we might have an understanding of, but also there are bits that we don't. Now, I want us to have just a moment, so I'm going to ask some questions, just read them out in a line about some of the big stuff about maybe God and faith and Christianity. And I know you have those questions, so maybe here the best thing to do in this weird space where I'm sat in my garage and you're watching this on a phone or a laptop or something, I'd love for it to still have a chance for you to think and process these questions. And I can't be there with you to answer them all in person, but we can start to at least verbalize them and think them through and maybe hand them over to God and say, either I'll get an answer somewhere or I won't. And that's okay. But just as it helps us think about suffering, can you remember a time when you hurt yourself? Maybe you fell over, maybe you slipped off something, maybe you needed to go to the hospital. Think about the process of what happened. And when we think about suffering, what sort of things come to mind? What questions do you have when it comes to thinking about suffering? What would you ask God? Do you struggle with the fact that God is good, but bad things happen? And if you could ask him one question, what would you ask him about suffering? And I think a really good question about that is, what do you think he might say? If you were to ask that question, what do you think God would say in response? So when we think about suffering and how it affects us and the different things that we go through when we suffer or we see people we love suffer, there's definitely, we know, a journey and a process as we go through suffering. So there's a couple of things I'm just going to ask. These are, again, very random questions, but I promise you they're leading to something. So some of these are really easy and they'll build up, but who thinks they could eat a jam donut without licking their lips? Okay, fairly easy question. Who could eat a whole lemon like you would an orange? A little bit harder to get through. Could you take a freezing cold shower for 5 full minutes? Who could? So could you, or do you know someone who could, do 100 push-ups right now? Who do you know who could lift 50 kg weight? Maybe you can. Who do you know who could participate in a mud race or a marathon? Do you know someone who can swim 80,000 meters? Who could cycle 150 miles? And who do you know who could climb Kilimanjaro? Now, if you know someone who can do some or all of those things, what do those things make of us? What do they teach us? What do they help us grow in? There's a quote from an author called Corrie ten Boom, which is one of the coolest names for an old lady. She's not alive anymore, but she was, in the prime of her writing, she was just this sweet old lady, but she's got the name Ten Boom. Brilliant. But she says, you can never learn that Christ is all you need until Christ is all you have. And so she's talking about this sense of when you go through suffering, when you go through something really difficult, like some of those challenges, climbing a mountain, running a marathon, they're really hard, they're really difficult, they're really grueling. But from those things, sometimes there's a real learning, a real growth, a real strength, and it can make us stronger. There is a verse from Romans 5. Romans 5 verses 3 to 5. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So we know that through our suffering, we can grow. And we know that in the midst of pain, we are able to, as that quote says, that we can learn that Christ is all we need when actually we end up in a place where that's all we've got. And that's not the greatest place perhaps to choose to find Christ, but it's also a great opportunity to. So I think if I think about it, how that story might reflect to me, how can I think of a time when that's been really true? So about 10, 11 years ago, I used to cycle to Earlswood Station to get a train to work. And I did that every day, backwards and forwards, for a couple of years. And on one of the days, I got to going up that Pendleton Hill Road, the one that's by Reigate School. I got halfway up that hill and realised for the first day ever, I'd forgotten to put my helmet on. Always wear a helmet because I'm a good boy, and so should you all, boys and girls. I got to nearly all the way to the top of that hill and realised I didn't have my helmet. So I had two choices, which was to cycle back and get my helmet, or to just go to the station and then come back again. And I thought, do you know what? Statistically, I'll be all right for one journey. There are hundreds of people who don't wear helmets. They'll be fine. So I went the other side of the hill, crossed down to the station, and just as I was getting towards the station, a transit van ignored a giveaway going 45 miles an hour and hit me. They broke my ankle, but also my head, when I hit the ground, hit the concrete. Now, there's two parts of this story that I'll get to. So one thing happened from that accident. It triggered something called a cluster headache. So that is a condition I now have. It's a permanent condition. It's not going to go away. It's a neurological nerve disorder. So Ryan from church also has this. But effectively what it does is it gives headaches that are excruciatingly painful. Now, they're constant. They're called cluster headaches because they normally come in periods of, for 3 months you have headaches and they get really strong. Or when you get the headache, you might get 2 or 3 days of an excruciating pain and then it goes. For me, for the last 10 years, I've had a headache every day. Of a mild form, and then at certain points there's a massive peak and the pain is close to unbearable. So a lot of people who suffer with this need oxygen to help them breathe when they're going through the pain, but I have an injection that I can take. So they are quite severe headaches. But in the middle of all of this, when I first encountered them at their worst, and I would be in absolute agony, the only thing that stopped it hurting, the only thing that distracted me, was I would put headphones on, listen to worship music, and just talk to God. And I remember in desperation saying, there's nothing else. I've taken all the medication, taken the injection, taken the pills. Nothing is easing the pain. I need you. And it has worked for the last 10 years that when they're at their worst pain, Christ sees me through the pain. So what I would say is the pain doesn't instantly disappear. And I've still got cluster headaches. It's not gone. But I see them through praying and worshipping. I see them through the space of that suffering with God. And it's interesting because that Psalm 23 that we read at the beginning, it starts with this: the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down. We have this amazing kind of excitement from David as he's written this psalm. And there's a line in there that says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. I love that verse. But what's great about understanding that line is, it doesn't say, when my enemies are around me, you crush them. When my enemies come at me, you eliminate them and they're gone. Then you set a table for me. It doesn't say you are ahead smashing all the enemies so I don't even know I've got enemies and then you lay a table for me. It says you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. And so what I think that psalm is telling us is that we are meant to go through these things knowing that they may still be there. They may still be a presence. They may still have the burden of whatever the suffering is around, but a table, and by table I believe that means the things we need to get through. It's using table because we think of food, sustenance, the stuff we need to get on. But I think it's just the stuff that whatever we need, if that's somebody's encouragement, someone's love, someone physically picking us up, something getting us through, he will do that in the midst of it. It doesn't always mean that the enemy, the thing, will disappear and go. And I do think that's really helpful to remember, that in the space of suffering, he's not gone, he doesn't disappear. He's trying to still break through and let us know and hear him. And believe me when I say this, it's really hard sometimes when I'm going through a bad cluster headache to remember, I've just got to dive in. I've got to lean in on God. I've got to. There isn't anything else. The medicine isn't going to do it. People aren't doing it. What we know, what we understand about the Bible, if we look right at the beginning, even right through to the end, the same thing happens over and over again, which is we're being reminded. We see right in the beginning with Genesis, when Adam is there, God says it's not good for him to be alone. It's not good for us to be alone. And so what I think, when we go through suffering, the worst thing we can do is to try to go through suffering with no one, without telling anyone, without asking for help, without being in a space where you could say to someone, I'm not okay. And so, yes, suffering is difficult. Yes, it's hard for the things that it will bring to us. We have a God who wants to lay a table before us in the presence of that suffering and our enemies. But we also know that it's not good for us to be alone. So these are things that you need to kind of work through with people, with friends, with family. And I know that there's something that's bigger at play when we think about, well, what I guess one thing we've not unpacked yet is what happens if we know there's suffering and there's nothing really we can do about it, and we're meant to just go through it, and we know God's there through it. Well, that just seems like a really long journey from what the Bible tells us about Revelation, that when he comes back, when the world is restored, there will be no tears. Every eye will be wiped dry. And that sounds awesome when we know that, but what about the space in between? And I do think when we look at this, there's a space of saying, well, we can't stop suffering. We're called to be, when Jesus comes back to the disciples and he talks about that journey next, that next step for them, when he returns to them before ascending, he talks about what they need to do now. And part of that is building the kingdom in between. And that is about, in that space of where things aren't great, how do we change that? Now, we can't change the free will of the world and the things that other people might do. We can't necessarily stop that, but what can we do? And so an example I can think of is a few years back, there were hurricanes that swept through America and Haiti. Now, Haiti was hit by the very same hurricane, but still has impact right now. That hurricane still has left people in poverty who are still struggling, still building their life back. And there are charities and amazing organisations building with Haiti, with the people of Haiti, to restore that. But that same hurricane also swept through the southwest of America, and they're fine. And so what I'm trying to point out there is, where there was wealth, when the disaster struck, they picked themselves up and they carried on. Where there wasn't, it's been hard. It's been a longer road. And so I believe in that space of the kingdom that we're meant to build, while there is suffering, we're here. We have this amazing choice and opportunity and privilege to make a difference in the suffering for someone else. To make a difference, to say, well, that suffering thing is going to happen. So how can I change that? And we know that pain and suffering and struggle, another way to refer to them is the dark times, the darkness that might feel like it's creeping in. So we get to choose to, if we're going through it, ask someone, could you be light with me? Because I can't do it. But if we see someone else struggling, we can choose to be light. We can choose to be hope. So I want to challenge us to do something. I'm going to try and do this as well over the next week. What I want you to do is this is a really odd time. This is a weird space that we're in with coronavirus, with isolating, with being at home, not being in school. And so I don't think any of us know someone who isn't struggling. And you might be the person who's struggling. So a little challenge for this week is to reach out to someone. So that could be to send a text. It could be to, as long as you're safe, drop a note to their home. It could be just to send an email or whatever method through technology you want to, really, just to say, I care about you. Is there anything I can do for you? And if you can, and I encourage you to, tell them you're praying for them. And that is a braver step, but it can make a huge difference. If you feel brave enough, find a verse that you feel would really help them. Maybe put together a care package, again, safely, with some things that, maybe it's things you could make, maybe it's if you've got a little bit of spare money and you want to buy them a packet of sweets. But again, be careful about that. Don't go out unless you need to. I can't stress that enough. I don't want to encourage the spread of anything. Maybe, and this is going to feel weird as well, but maybe the person that you need to be helping through that suffering is in the house with you now. And maybe what you need is to just spend some time with them. And that might look like, do you want to sit down and read a book? Do you want to sit down and play a card game? Do you want to sit down and talk? I'll make you a drink. I'll make you something. But whatever it is, surprise someone by leaning in and saying, how can I help? If you feel like right now you're the person who needs that help, that's okay too. Can I ask you to be brave enough to say, I'll text someone, I'll message them, and I'll just say, I'm not doing great. Can you pray for me? When there is suffering and you can see it, how can you be light? How can you be hope? You might not be able to stop the suffering, but can you bring something that will make the suffering easier for somebody? So let's try that challenge. Let's try and reach out to someone. Let's remember those things that we've gone over today. If any of it doesn't make sense, these are big questions. Reach out to maybe one of us as the youth workers. I absolutely can't promise you that we will have the answer, but we will have time for you and we will have care for you. I'd love to just close quickly in prayer. God, you are good. You are a good God, and I know that we have moments where we look at the things that go on and the world around us, the actions of others, but also just how the world shifts and changes, and big events and big disasters happen, and we often look to you and say, why? Or how am I meant to go forward with this? God, I pray in that space that you hear our questions and allow us, with your grace and your mercy, to move into a place where we say, how can I help? What would you have me do? How can I be light and hope when it is hard? And how can I find and lean into you and grow? Thank you for each member of this group, for the leaders, for the families involved, for this community, for this church. And we just ask, Lord, for you to be with those through this difficult time, through this time that feels a really long period of challenge and suffering, God. But we know there is light. We know there is hope. And we thank you for it. Amen. Thank you, guys. Have a good week.